It began with a whisper, then a tidal wave. October 2009 and 9. In the dim blue of early morning, a cargo vessel drifted just off the Uruguayan coast. The ship's name was Maui, but what it carried was far from tropical. Beneath tarps and crates marked as agricultural equipment were dozens of dark containers packed tight with something far more lucrative, something far more lethal: cocaine. Not bricks, not kilos, but 2.7 metric tons, enough to lace every city in Europe with its own personal apocalypse. Uruguayan customs officers, backed by DEA intelligence and Serbian operatives from BIA, moved swiftly. They had been tracking whispers on encrypted lines, movement from ports in Santos, Brazil, and erratic cargo patterns that defied logic. The Maui had been flagged weeks prior. This was no accident. It was a trap laid carefully and finally sprung. What they found stunned even the most seasoned agents. Rows of industrial containers stuffed with Colombian-grade cocaine, purity levels north of 90%, street value north of $500 million. But it wasn't just the volume, it was the signature, packed and marked with codes only one organization had ever used: Group America. And just like that, the world had a name to fear again. Group America had been ghost-like for years, a legend whispered in courtrooms and intelligence briefings, a network born from the ashes of Cold War mafia structures thriving in the chaotic post-Yugoslav era. They didn't need blood to assert dominance. They had logistics, they had loyalty, and they had Darko Šarić, the invisible hand behind it all. This one bust, this one ship, was the crack in the dam. And from that crack would flow a series of revelations, arrests, betrayals, and a global manhunt that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Uruguay to the political chambers of Belgrade. Cocaine had been flooding into Europe for years, through Spain, through Italy. But the Balkan route, once known for heroin, had adapted. Cocaine now traveled through Serbia, Montenegro, and Croatia, disguised beneath legitimate trade, hidden in yachts, tucked into diplomatic shipments. It was a trade built not on brute force, but on sophistication, with ties that reached from Medellin to Milan. At the center of this spiderweb, one man remained conspicuously absent from every scene. No phone records, no emails, no fingerprints, only whispers and wired funds. Darko Šarić wasn't your average cartel boss. He was a businessman, a ghost in a tailored suit, building a silent empire while the world slept. Now, with Maui's cargo in custody, the chessboard shifted. DEA agents moved with precision. Serbia's intelligence agency ramped up surveillance. Offshore accounts were flagged. Shell companies collapsed. People began to vanish, some arrested, others not so lucky. But Šarić, he was gone. By the time authorities tied the cocaine shipment to his name, the man himself had vanished without a trace. Last seen boarding a private jet out of Sao Paulo, he melted into the fabric of South America like he had never existed. It would be 5 years before anyone laid eyes on him again. This wasn't just another drug bust. It was the unveiling of a machine, a criminal architecture so refined, so embedded, that even law enforcement found themselves caught in awe. The Maui seizure wasn't a climax. It was an overture. And from that moment, a new game began. Code name, Operation Balkan Warrior. Its mission: follow the money, trace the cargo, break the network, and capture the man the DEA had quietly labeled one of the most dangerous traffickers in Europe. As the Maui rusted in port, sealed in crime scene tape and blue tarps, the cocaine inside began to rot under the weight of heat and silence. But outside, the war was only beginning. This is that story. The story of how one man, fluent in politics, finance, and fear, turned the Balkans into a cocaine highway, and how the world decided to take it back. From New York to Belgrade, the name Group America didn't begin with drugs. It began with exile. In the smoky shadows of 1970s New York, when the Italian mafia was bleeding into the fabric of the city's underworld, a different kind of syndicate was forming quietly, discreetly among immigrants who bore the scars of a homeland fractured by war. Serbian, Montenegrin, and Croatian expats settled in Queens and Brooklyn, bringing with them a legacy of violence, loyalty, and survival. They didn't arrive with blueprints for a cartel. They arrived with a void. The group's early core orbited around Boško Radonjić, a Serbian-American enforcer with ties to the Westies gang of Hell's Kitchen. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people moved. He taught them that strength wasn't just about fear, it was about silence. Profit wasn't in bloodshed, it was in control. When the streets ran hot with bullets, they learned to work in shadows, playing longer games. Import, export, smuggling, real estate, loan sharking, not flashy, but always expanding. As the decades passed, Group America began to evolve like a virus, mutating in plain sight. The Cold War thawed, Yugoslavia fractured. New passports, new allegiances, new chaos. What had been an ethnic brotherhood in exile became an international machine. The group moved their operations back to the Balkans. Belgrade became the new boardroom. That's when things escalated. Through the 1990s, the Balkan Wars masked the growth of a deeper criminal undercurrent. Black markets thrived. Soldiers turned smugglers. Generals moonlighted as arms dealers. Sanctions bred desperation, and desperation bred opportunity. Group America inserted itself perfectly into the cracks of this new world order. They didn't just traffic drugs, they trafficked influence. Judges, bankers, customs officers, in Serbia, in Montenegro, in Croatia. They understood that money moves faster when it wears a badge. By 2000, they were no longer just a New York offshoot, they were a transnational entity with a clean face. They used front companies, shipping firms, agricultural imports, construction giants. Their paperwork was pristine, their shipments masked, their trails swept. And at the helm of this reshaped empire stood a man no one in law enforcement had even heard of. Yet, Darko Šarić. He wasn't part of the original circle in Queens. He was homegrown, born in Pljevlja, Montenegro, in the late 1960s. A slender, calculating man with pale blue eyes and an MBA-level mind for business. He didn't carry a gun. He carried ledgers. Fluent in 4 languages, he could speak to bankers in Vienna and dock workers in Santos with the same cold efficiency. Šarić started small logistics shipping, importing Brazilian soybeans into Europe. Legal on paper, profitable. But he saw something others didn't. The route itself was the real gold mine. Every container, every crate was a blank canvas. He didn't need new products. He needed new payloads. And so the pivot began. He built trust in South America through calculated partnerships with local cartels. Not flashy, not loud. He offered them something different, a direct corridor to Europe, skipping Spain and Italy, moving cleanly through Serbia, Hungary, Austria, and into Western markets. The Balkan route, once a relic of heroin smuggling in the 1990s, was reborn. Šarić never met with street dealers. He didn't need to. His job was systems, not scenes. He outsourced the dirty work. Laundering was handled through Monaco, Luxembourg, and anonymous holdings in Cyprus. Even when payments slipped or ports tightened, he remained untouched. What made Group America different wasn't its brutality. It was its efficiency. They didn't leave trails of blood, they left balance sheets. And in that quiet clinical approach, they became unstoppable. By 2008, the organization was moving tons of cocaine per shipment. Not grams, not kilos, tons, delivered by air, sea, and road, with cover from bribed officials and shell corporations, and still no one could name its leader. Until the Maui seizure, until 2.7 tons of cocaine were tied back not to a cartel boss from Colombia or Mexico, but to a Montenegrin businessman with a passport, a portfolio, and zero criminal record. Suddenly the myth had a name, Šarić, and the world had a new face of organized crime. The rise of Darko Šarić. Before he became the ghost behind a billion-dollar cocaine empire, Darko Šarić was invisible for all the right reasons. Born in 1969 in Pljevlja, a small industrial town in northern Montenegro, Šarić grew up in the gray shadows of a post-Tito Yugoslavia. His father worked in construction. His mother, a quiet woman, kept house. There was nothing remarkable in the early chapters of his life. No early signs of violence, no flashy brushes with the law. If anything, he was just another smart kid trying to make it out of a town where ambition rarely paid. He studied economics, moved with precision, and never raised his voice. But he listened closely, and in the post-war vacuum of the 1990s, he saw what others missed, a new economy rising not from textbooks, but from chaos. Montenegro, then part of the union with Serbia, became a strange playground, politically fluid, economically underdeveloped and ripe for exploitation. Sanctions crippled legitimate markets. Black market fuel, cigarettes, weapons, and pharmaceuticals became the new currencies. Everyone was buying, everyone was selling, and everyone was desperate. It was the perfect place for a man like Šarić to disappear by learning how to appear legitimate. He started in shipping, one of the oldest covers in the book. Through companies like Pura Vida and Myanmar, he built an image as a successful entrepreneur trading soybeans and sugar from South America to Europe. His ships ran through major ports in Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. On paper, he was a global trader with ties in Belgrade and Sao Paulo. He registered his firms in tax havens, hired international accountants, and always stayed 2 steps ahead. But it wasn't sugar Šarić was interested in. It was cocaine. By 2004, Šarić's name began surfacing in encrypted chatter picked up by U.S. and Serbian intelligence. He wasn't directing murders. He wasn't running meth labs. He was doing something far more dangerous, building a clean, scalable model for drug logistics. He was turning cocaine into cargo. What separated Šarić from street-level dealers, or even traditional kingpins, was his discipline. He didn't use drugs. He didn't party. He didn't court violence. His life was a string of spreadsheets, secure phone calls, and relocations. He invested heavily in encryption and counter-surveillance, hired ex-KGB cyber operatives, created firewalls between layers of his organization, so thick even his inner circle didn't always know who they were working for. But behind that cold efficiency, there was ambition, calculated, precise, and relentless. Šarić didn't want a corner of the market. He wanted the route itself. If you owned the pipeline, you didn't need to produce the drug. Others could cook, cut, and bag it. All he needed to do was deliver. He built trust among South American cartels, not through threats, but through reliability. When he promised a shipment would arrive in Antwerp, it arrived. When a route through Montenegro needed a customs officer to look the other way, the envelope was there before the request. He became invaluable. In turn, Group America became the preferred carrier for multiple South American producers, while other cartels faced raids, betrayals, and turf wars. Šarić's operation moved like a ghost convoy, silent, efficient, and deeply embedded within trade routes no one dared touch. Even when a shipment went missing or someone talked, Šarić didn't panic. He reorganized, quietly, strategically. He wasn't interested in loyalty born of fear. He preferred employees who understood business. But make no mistake, violence was never off the table. Those who betrayed him disappeared. Those who skimmed were made examples. But it was always quiet, always clean, a car crash, a suicide, a body never found. By 2008, Šarić was living between Montenegro and South America, using a network of fake identities, armored convoys, and private jets. He had properties in Sao Paulo, Belgrade, and Buenos Aires. His fleet included cargo ships, yachts, and legitimate businesses producing everything from fruit juice to pharmaceuticals. And yet, to most of the world, he remained a name in a ledger. Even when DEA analysts began sketching out the Balkan route as a growing threat to Europe's drug stability, they had no face for the man at the center. No video, no voice, just wire transfers, satellite images, and whispers. Until Maui. Until 2.7 tons of cocaine surfaced in Uruguay. And for the first time, someone finally said it aloud. This is Šarić. The man with no fingerprints had just left his first. The Balkan pipeline. There is a myth that drug empires rise through violence, that bullets and bodies pave the road to power. But Darko Šarić built his kingdom on something quieter: infrastructure. To understand the scale of his empire, you have to understand the route. Not just where the drugs came from, but how they moved, who they passed through, and how the system protected itself like an immune response to law enforcement. The cocaine pipeline that Šarić mastered didn't look like a criminal enterprise. It looked like commerce. It began in Colombia and Bolivia, where raw product was processed in jungle laboratories and loaded onto trucks headed for the Atlantic. From there, it passed through Brazil, specifically the port of Santos, one of the busiest in Latin America. Hidden within containers of bananas, soybeans, and frozen meats, the cocaine made its way to ships bearing legitimate cargo manifests. But these weren't just random shipments. Šarić's people owned the logistics firms. They pre-cleared customs. They held advanced knowledge of inspection patterns, sometimes even receiving insider tips on which containers would be scanned. It wasn't luck. It was surgical corruption, targeted and sustained. From Brazil, the containers traveled thousands of miles across the Atlantic. Not to Spain or Italy, as many expected. Šarić bypassed those hot zones. Instead, he funneled the cargo through lesser-monitored Eastern European ports, Bar in Montenegro, Koper, in Slovenia, Ploča in Croatia. From there, inland distribution was handled by truck and rail. Serbia became the crossroads. From Belgrade, the cocaine spread like wildfire into Hungary, Austria, Germany, and beyond. Each country along the way served a function not just geographically, but operationally. Montenegro, the access point, a coastline with just enough legal opacity to allow shipment rotations without too many questions. Serbia, the operations hub, a mix of government connections, business fronts, and aging criminal networks dating back to the Yugoslav wars. Šarić invested in political figures, sponsored sporting events, and even funded public projects, not out of generosity, but out of calculation. Visibility makes you seem legitimate. Hungary and Austria. The corridor. Silent, fast-moving, with minimal border friction once inside the EU. Germany and the Netherlands. The market. Here Šarić had less control, but more profit. Local gangs handled the street-level distribution. He never touched it. To manage this behemoth, Šarić used layers. Each node in the network only knew the one above and below. Drivers had no names. Middlemen changed SIM cards every 48 hours. Payments moved through cryptocurrency and offshore banks in Cyprus, Malta, and Liechtenstein. His finance team alone operated like a hedge fund, executing wire transfers at precise intervals to avoid detection by international regulators. But the brilliance wasn't in the volume. It was in the system's flexibility. If a port tightened security, the next shipment rerouted through a different country. If an informant was suspected, they were cut off before they could talk. If a customs official asked for more money, Šarić sent a reminder, "You work for the system now, not the other way around." By 2009, DEA analysts had started to notice the shift. Cocaine seizures in Europe were increasing, but the origin stories didn't match traditional routes, and the purity off the charts. This wasn't low-grade product smuggled by desperate couriers. This was wholesale-scale, industrial precision. Group America had become the Amazon of drug logistics, and all of it was hidden beneath a perfectly legal enterprise. Dozens of front companies registered under relatives, shell firms, and fake addresses. Warehouse leases that led to empty lots. Corporate directors who were either dead or didn't exist. Šarić didn't innovate the drug trade. He streamlined it. Even as investigations grew more aggressive, there were no wiretaps with his voice. No fingerprints, no photos of him near a dock or a shipment. He was a name in a cloud of silence, a phantom CEO of a deadly supply chain. And yet, something in the system cracked. The Maui. It was supposed to be another clean-run routine, but someone talked. Somewhere, a gap opened. An insider flipped, and suddenly the product was sitting in a Uruguayan port, wrapped in DEA tape. Šarić's empire had just suffered its first public blow, and the world finally was paying attention. The moment the DEA confirmed the Maui seizure in October 2009, everything shifted. This wasn't just another drug bust, it was a signal flare. For years, European law enforcement had suspected the existence of a well-oiled Balkan pipeline. Now they had physical evidence, they had cargo, they had coordinates, and more importantly, they had a name. Darko Šarić. Behind closed doors, the operation had already been brewing. Intelligence agents in the United States, Serbia, Montenegro, Brazil, and Uruguay had been piecing together scattered whispers, encrypted communications, financial inconsistencies, suspicious shipping patterns. But nothing had been conclusive. Nothing had stuck. Until now. The code name was simple and surgical, Operation Balkan Warrior. The mission cut the head off the beast. The task force was multinational and covert. The DEA served as strategic command, leveraging satellite imaging, maritime records, and financial tracking. Serbia's Security Intelligence Agency BIA operated boots-on-the-ground surveillance, using human informants and undercover agents embedded deep within Šarić's legitimate business empire. Uruguay's customs officers had become the first line of action, but they were now part of a far larger game. Everything had to be silent, surgical, swift. In Belgrade, BIA agents quietly placed Šarić's known properties under round-the-clock surveillance. Cameras went up on lampposts. Drones swept over warehouses. Every movement was logged, every call recorded. But there was one problem. Darko Šarić was gone, disappeared, vanished. No flight records, no border stamps. His private jet had left Sao Paulo 2 days before the Maui was boarded, then went dark. No one could confirm where he had landed. This wasn't a man on the run. This was a man who had prepared for the storm before it even came. Operation Balkan Warrior shifted gears. If they couldn't get Šarić directly, they would starve his empire. One by one, agents began targeting the arteries of his network. In Montenegro, warehouses were raided under the cover of tax audits. Financial regulators flagged suspicious transfers linked to Šarić's agricultural companies. In Serbia, his alleged accountants were detained for questioning, though none of them dared speak his name. In Slovenia, a customs official quietly flipped after being promised immunity. His testimony confirmed what many had suspected. The Balkan pipeline wasn't leaking, it was wide open. Behind the scenes, investigators built a web map, a sprawling digital blueprint of transactions, aliases, companies, and phone numbers. The central node always led to the same ghost, Darko Šarić. But it was in Brazil where the biggest break occurred. A warehouse in Santos, linked to one of Šarić's shipping fronts, was raided by Brazilian federal police acting on a DEA tip. Inside, agents discovered not just evidence of cocaine trafficking, but something more valuable: ledgers, handwritten, coded, and incredibly detailed. Dates, quantities, port names, pseudonyms, payments. One ledger entry stood out: M.U. 2700. Maui, Uruguay, 2.7 tons. It was the first direct link. Back in Serbia, this intelligence hit like a lightning bolt. Prosecutors moved quickly. Warrants were issued. Interpol was contacted. And in January 2010, a red notice was filed for Darko Šarić. He was now a fugitive of international law. But even as the walls closed in, Šarić's operation didn't fully collapse. That was the terrifying part. The machine kept running. Containers still moved, payments still cleared, couriers still delivered. His lieutenants maintained operations with clinical discipline. For a while, it seemed like cutting off the head might not stop the body. Then a twist. One of Šarić's inner circle flipped. His name remains classified to this day. But his testimony marked a turning point. He gave up smuggling routes, offshore accounts, safe houses across Venezuela and Argentina. Most importantly, he described the extraction plan, how Šarić rotated between fake passports, moved under diplomatic cover, and traveled by sea when airspace got too risky. He wasn't just hiding, he was waiting, watching the chessboard reset. But Operation Balkan Warrior had changed the rules. They didn't need to catch him red-handed. They just needed to make his world smaller, inch by inch, contact by contact, dollar by dollar. And somewhere in the pressure, in the isolation, cracks would form. They always do. When Darko Šarić vanished, he didn't go underground. He went upscale. While international authorities scrambled to locate him through airports and surveillance footage, Šarić was already slipping into the folds of South America's elite. He wasn't hiding in basements or jungle camps. He was sipping espresso in Buenos Aires, walking polished corridors in Caracas, boarding yachts in Isla Margarita, under a name no one could pronounce, but everyone feared. He became a ghost in a suit, living in plain sight among the rich, the corrupt, and the untouchable. Armed with an arsenal of forged passports, some reportedly issued with diplomatic credentials from sympathetic regimes, Šarić moved like vapor through Venezuela, Argentina, and Brazil. He kept close to coastal cities, favoring private resorts, gated compounds, and places where law enforcement arrived late and bribes arrived early. His connections were no longer just Balkan. They had grown, absorbing fragments of failed states, rogue bankers, and drug barons turned politicians. In Venezuela, he found protection, not just from money, but from disorder. The country's political instability served as the perfect smokescreen. Šarić is believed to have used aliases such as Daniel Vledo or Sandro Kovac, bolstered by local officials willing to look the other way for a price. It wasn't just evasion, it was control. He communicated through couriers, never phones. Meetings were held on open water, far from microphones or satellites. When agents tracked a lead to a boutique hotel in Maracaibo, Šarić was already gone 4 hours prior. A private car escorted him to a marina, and from there a speedboat carried him into international waters. He left behind nothing but empty espresso cups and a receipt with no fingerprints. Operation Balkan Warrior watched helplessly. They had the map, they had the pattern, but they didn't have him. Then came the close call in 2011. An anonymous tipster claimed Šarić would be attending a quiet summit in Sao Paulo, an informal meeting of financiers and smugglers to renegotiate distribution shares after the Maui bust. Brazilian federal police, working alongside DEA agents, staked out the hotel. Hours passed, no sign. Then a man entered through a service elevator, face obscured by a low-brimmed hat and medical mask. 2 operatives moved in, but as they prepared to intercept a black SUV pulled up at the back entrance, within seconds, the man was gone. A decoy. The real Šarić had never entered the building. He was playing a longer game. During these fugitive years, Šarić wasn't just surviving, he was adjusting. He shifted routes, consolidated his most loyal lieutenants, focused less on quantity and more on resilience. The system became leaner, smarter, harder to trace. And despite the heat, money still moved through Diamond's offshore trust's high-value real estate. But not everything was perfect. His world, once wide and borderless, was beginning to shrink. Trusted allies were falling, some arrested, some turning. His family, once free to move, was now under scrutiny. Bank accounts froze. Properties seized. One of his closest associates was found dead in a Serbian river execution style. It was a message, and he understood it. Power without presence is fragile. Šarić began to feel the weight of isolation. He no longer controlled the narrative, he was reacting to it. While he hid, the Serbian government moved aggressively to dismantle his assets. Operation Balkan Warrior had done its job. It hadn't caught him, but it had caged him. The once invisible kingpin now lived like a man, always checking over his shoulder. In early 2014, something shifted. Unconfirmed reports surfaced that Šarić had sent out discreet feelers, back-channel communications, through intermediaries offering a peaceful solution. Some thought it was desperation. Others believed it was strategy. But the message was clear. Šarić was ready to talk. Weeks later, under intense secrecy, negotiations began. They weren't held in courtrooms or through embassies. They happened in yachts, encrypted emails, and hotel rooms registered under fictitious companies. The terms confidential. The goal, a surrender. But Šarić had conditions. He wanted safety. He wanted assurances. And he wanted to surrender not as prey, but on his own terms. In March 2014, in a surprise twist, few believed possible, the man who had dodged the world for 5 years walked willingly into custody, not in Serbia, but in Venezuela. The extradition process, orchestrated with surgical precision, rerouted him through Podgorica, then finally to Belgrade. There were no cameras, no crowds, just a handshake, a signature, and a ghost becoming visible again. The world had been chasing him. Now the world would finally hear his voice. With Darko Šarić in custody, the air around Operation Balkan Warrior shifted, but not in the way most imagined. There was no victory parade, no chest-pounding press conference, just a long exhaled breath from the agents who had hunted a phantom across 5 countries, 5 years, and a labyrinth of false leads. But the war was far from over. Šarić's surrender was the most visible crack in the empire. But what investigators knew, and what Šarić knew even better, was that a criminal structure that big doesn't collapse just because its figurehead is in chains. It collapses when you tear apart its pressure points. The Serbian government, in coordination with DEA and Europol analysts, understood the delicate balance that held Group America together, a web of mid-level operatives, accountants, customs officials, and logistics experts, most of whom still operated with partial autonomy. The challenge wasn't to catch them all. It was to cut their lines of communication before the system could rebuild itself. The pressure began with the bankers. Agents quietly began interrogating financial institutions across Eastern Europe, looking not for large, flashy transactions, but for anomalies, frequent wire transfers under $10,000, real estate deals conducted in cash, offshore trusts in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands bearing Slavic names. One Serbian bank manager, known to have facilitated consulting fees for Šarić-owned fronts, cracked after 48 hours of interrogation, not with a name, but with an account trail. That single lead triggered a cascade of subpoenas that exposed an entire constellation of shell companies tied to Šarić's operation. Next came the lawyers, the faceless architects behind the paper empire. They had drafted contracts, notarized fake ownership documents, created layers of plausible deniability, so thick even prosecutors struggled to penetrate them. But under mounting pressure, threats of disbarment, tax audits, frozen assets, several began cooperating. One revealed a storage facility just outside of Novi Sad, where records spanning over a decade were held under biometric lock. Inside were boxes of contracts, transaction logs, and encrypted devices. And within those boxes, a roadmap, names, dates, coded aliases, and a few real ones. But pressure is not just about cracking the loyal. It's about isolating the loyal from the fearful. Investigators turned their focus to the drivers, the port workers, the mid-tier operatives whose job had been to move the product without ever asking questions. These were the men who knew the routes, the containers, the frequencies, and many of them were vulnerable, low-income, high-exposure, and now with their boss behind bars, expendable. One driver arrested at the Hungary-Serbia border agreed to cooperate in exchange for protection. His statement provided a revelation. Šarić's empire wasn't just a smuggling operation, it was a logistics business with a corporate structure. There were departments, supervisors, even an informal HR network that vetted new hires. The picture came into focus. Group America hadn't just smuggled drugs. It had replicated the shape of a Fortune 500 company minus the legality. And then came the digital frontier. Encrypted laptops seized during coordinated raids began to give up their secrets slowly. Hidden behind layers of military-grade security were internal chat logs, shipment spreadsheets, even surveillance footage of ports and meeting locations. But what struck investigators most was the tone. The conversations weren't laced with fear or urgency. They were calm, professional, efficient. Orders were placed like inventory. Delays were discussed like shipping backups. Profits and losses were analyzed with cold detachment. This wasn't crime. This was commerce. But as the pressure mounted, even the most disciplined structures began to show strain. In late 2014, a warehouse in Bar, Montenegro, one that had evaded multiple inspections, mysteriously caught fire. Investigators arrived to find nothing but ash and the warped remains of shipping containers. Insurance paperwork had already been filed before the fire. A few weeks later, two mid-level operatives, one in Slovenia, one in Austria, disappeared within 24 hours of each other. No signs of struggle, no ransom notes, just gone. Word spread through the network, no one was safe. And somewhere inside a Belgrade prison cell, Darko Šarić knew this was the part he had prepared for. He had trained his empire to operate without him, to adapt, to survive. But what even he couldn't control was the fear. Fear changes loyalty. Fear turns men into ghosts. And as investigators pressed harder, flipping one domino at a time, the empire began to tilt. It would not collapse in one dramatic explosion. It would bleed quietly from 1,000 tiny cuts. When the news broke that Darko Šarić had surrendered, it barely made headlines outside of Serbia. But for those who had spent years chasing his shadow, it was a seismic shift. Not just because they had finally captured him, but because he had chosen to come in, voluntarily. The world expected a dramatic raid, a shootout, a grainy photo of a man dragged in cuffs from a jungle hideout. What they got instead was a press release. No blood, no drama, just paperwork. But behind that paperwork was a deal, one forged in secrecy, balanced between law politics and the raw calculus of self-preservation. Šarić had been watching. From exile, he monitored arrests, financial freezes, political changes. He had spent years building his network to run without him. But he knew better than anyone time was running out, not just legally, but structurally. His empire was fracturing. His safe houses were compromised. Some of his most trusted men were no longer answering calls, or worse, were answering someone else's. It wasn't fear that brought him to the table. It was strategy. He contacted intermediaries, lawyers, businessmen, possibly even political figures, offering a controlled surrender. He wouldn't be dragged in. He wouldn't be paraded. He wanted to return on his terms with conditions: safety, solitary detention, no extradition beyond Serbia, legal counsel of his choosing, and above all, a chance to speak. Because Šarić didn't just want a courtroom, he wanted a stage. The negotiations were delicate. The Serbian government had reason to play ball. Šarić's surrender would be a political win, a headline, a trophy to show the world that Serbia could police its own. But it had to be clean, no visible handshakes, no political stench. So the deal was framed as lawful, procedural, inevitable. In March 2014, Šarić resurfaced in Venezuela. He was quietly taken into custody under what officials later described as mutual legal assistance. The details were never fully disclosed. Some say he surrendered to Serbian intelligence agents in a hotel suite in Caracas. Others say he walked into the Serbian consulate and asked for a phone. What's known as this, within 72 hours, he was on a plane, not a prisoner transport, a chartered jet. The route was untraceable to the public, but flight logs later confirmed he landed in Podgorica, Montenegro's capital. From there, under armed escort, he was transferred to Belgrade, specifically to the special detention facility at Ustanička Street, a fortress designed for high-risk inmates. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. The first photograph of him in over 5 years showed a thinner, older Šarić eyes, still sharp behind the soft lines of fatigue. He wore a gray suit, no tie, his hands cuffed, but his posture unchanged. not broken, just waiting. Authorities moved fast. The Serbian Special Prosecutor's Office filed formal charges. The trial process began almost immediately. But no one missed the unspoken reality. Šarić had walked into prison like a man checking into a long meeting. Not as a confession, but as a move. He wasn't here to beg. He was here to bargain. From the moment he arrived, whispers began circulating that Šarić intended to cooperate to a point, not as an informant, not as a penitent, but as a strategist, looking to preserve what was left of his structure. Rumors suggested he had offered names in exchange for certain protections. Not for himself, he knew his sentence would be long, but perhaps for others. The prosecution team was cautious. Every interaction with him was tightly scripted, recorded, documented. He was treated as both a suspect and a potential witness to a far larger ecosystem of crime. And the ecosystem trembled. Within weeks of his surrender, several of his financial fronts folded. Properties were sold under duress. A handful of lower-level operatives turned themselves in. It wasn't just legal pressure. It was anticipation, the fear that Šarić might talk, or worse, redirect blame. But he didn't speak publicly. Not yet. In the courtroom, he remained measured. He denied direct involvement. A businessman, he said, not a drug lord. He admitted to knowing people who had broken laws, but claimed he had only ever handled legal trade. The prosecutors weren't surprised. The real value wasn't in what Šarić said. It was in what others thought he might say. That fear began to reshape the landscape. People fled. Others surfaced, offering deals of their own. One high-level customs officer in Montenegro offered a full confession in exchange for relocation. Another, in Austria, volunteered shipment manifests, implicating rival syndicates. The entire Balkan route, once airtight, began to leak. And through it all, Šarić sat quietly in his cell, playing a different game. He had surrendered his freedom, but in doing so, he'd kept his leverage. The courtroom wasn't made for a man like Darko Šarić. Its cold marble floors and fluorescent lights seemed too ordinary for the figure who had haunted 5 nations and orchestrated a billion-dollar empire from the shadows. Yet there he was, the ghost in a gray suit, seated behind bulletproof glass, facing a tribunal of judges, prosecutors, and a country waiting to see how myth would translate into evidence. It was October 2015 when the trial officially opened in the Special Department for Organized Crime in Belgrade. Tight security surrounded the building. Streets were cordoned off. Armed police patrolled every entrance. The press lined up behind barricades, lenses trained on a man who had gone from invisible to infamous in the span of a single arrest. Šarić entered quietly. No smirk, no theatrics, just that same unreadable expression he had worn since his extradition, a mix of calculation and distance. He greeted his lawyers with a nod. His family, seated in the gallery, barely moved. Every motion was deliberate, every glance rehearsed. This wasn't just a trial, it was a spectacle. The charges read like the plot of a political thriller. Participation in an international criminal organization, financing large-scale cocaine trafficking, laundering more than $20 million through phantom companies, and orchestrating a distribution network spanning 5 continents. But prosecutors knew better than to count on a dramatic confession. Instead, they built the case like a machine, assembling it piece by piece. Evidence came in waves. A ledger recovered from a Brazilian warehouse. Testimony from a former associate who had flipped in 2011. Flight records, wire transfers, satellite surveillance, containers linked to Šarić's shell companies, all traced back to the Maui shipment. One by one, witnesses were called. A former customs officer described how he had been paid in monthly envelopes left beneath a trash can outside a Belgrade cafe. A warehouse manager in Uruguay recalled receiving shipments labeled as soy protein, but warned never to open the crates. An accountant, his voice shaking, described laundering funds through fake agricultural subsidies, with orders always arriving via untraceable intermediaries. But the defense fought back hard. Šarić's legal team framed him as a businessman under siege. They denied the cocaine link, arguing that his name appeared nowhere in official documentation. The money, legal investments, they claimed, processed through licensed banks, declared through proper channels. They questioned the credibility of every witness, citing plea deals and inconsistencies. They called the entire prosecution a politically motivated hit job, a smear campaign to discredit Montenegrin business interests. And Šarić, he played the part of a man above it all. When asked directly whether he had any involvement in the Maui shipment, he responded coolly, "I've never seen that ship in my life." At times, he seemed almost detached from the proceedings, as if he were observing someone else's trial. But every now and then, a flicker, a half smile when a former associate fumbled under pressure, a tightening of the jaw when prosecutors mentioned names he hadn't expected to hear. He wasn't indifferent. He was watching. The courtroom atmosphere was electric. Spectators leaned forward during every testimony. Journalists filled notebooks with quotes and sketches. But there was also something else of fear. A quiet understanding that even in a cage, Darko Šarić remained dangerous. Some witnesses recanted. Others suddenly became unavailable. A few simply vanished. The trial stretched on for months. The complexity of the network, the volume of evidence, the constant legal maneuvering, it all slowed the process to a crawl. But beneath the surface, the strategy was clear. Wear the system down. Turn law into quicksand. Let fatigue be your ally. And yet cracks began to appear. A banker from Liechtenstein, subpoenaed under international cooperation, provided damning insight into a money trail that led directly to Šarić's inner circle. A protected witness in Austria delivered a recorded statement detailing a meeting in 2008 where Šarić himself allegedly approved a 900-kilo shipment bound for Antwerp, and a Slovak shipping agent, granted immunity, produced documents showing cargo ownership transfers that aligned perfectly with Šarić's travel records. The walls were closing in. In July 2015, the court handed down its verdict. Darko Šarić was found guilty of organizing the transport of nearly 6 tons of cocaine and laundering over 20 million, sentenced 20 years in prison. No appeals to conscience, no dramatic breakdowns, just the cold mechanics of justice grinding to its conclusion. Šarić remained still as the sentence was read. No protest, no visible emotion, just a long, controlled breath, like a man who had already calculated this outcome. Because for him, the trial was never about winning. It was about surviving the collapse. And when the courtroom emptied, and the press moved on, and the doors to his cell slammed shut, Šarić was still playing a game the world didn't fully understand. He had lost the case, but not the war. With its king behind bars and judgment passed, the world expected Group America to implode, to vanish in a puff of indictments and asset seizures. But empires like these don't go down with a single strike. They unravel slowly, silently from within. The first sign came not in Europe, but in South America. 6 months after Šarić's sentencing, Brazilian authorities raided a warehouse in Porto Alegre. The facility, listed under a now-defunct textile company, held no fabric but dozens of shipping containers, two of which contained hidden compartments, consistent with long-haul cocaine transport. No drugs were found, but the ledgers, they bore familiar codes. They weren't abandoned. They were pre-staged. Someone was still operating under Šarić's blueprint. Back in Europe, Serbian and Montenegrin investigators noticed an uptick in dead ends. Informants who had previously fed intel suddenly went quiet. Accounts under observation were drained in hours, their digital footprints scrubbed. Arrested couriers claimed ignorance, then disappeared on conditional release. Operations were no longer centralized, no longer organized in vertical hierarchies. What remained of Group America had evolved. It had fractured, but not in the way law enforcement hoped. Instead of collapsing, the empire splintered into miniature replicas, smaller cells operating independently, mimicking Šarić's methods, but without his control. His absence had created a vacuum, and in that void, new contenders emerged. Some were old lieutenants who broke off to protect their own corners. Others were external traffickers who had studied Šarić's logistics and adapted them to their own networks. They shared no banner, no loyalty, but they shared a playbook, and it was working. In Montenegro, two prominent businessmen, both previously tied to Group America, were found murdered within weeks of each other. No suspects, no motives. But the message was clear. There was a war for the leftovers. Meanwhile, in Serbia, prosecutors pursued secondary cases. They indicted 14 additional suspects connected to Šarić's laundering networks. One was a former soccer club president, another a well-known nightclub owner. Both denied knowledge of any criminal ties, but emails retrieved from a confiscated laptop suggested otherwise coded messages, financial transfers, private jet itineraries. Still, convictions were elusive. Witnesses refused to testify. Evidence went missing. One judge recused himself after receiving threats. Another in Austria was forced into protective custody after a surveillance team uncovered a planned kidnapping attempt targeting his family. The justice system, already strained, began to buckle under the paranoia. And all the while from his prison cell, Šarić maintained his silence. He didn't appeal. He didn't speak to the press. Occasionally he received visitors, family, lawyers, but never more than 30 minutes at a time. Guards described him as quiet, polite, unreadable. No outbursts, no complaints, just routines, exercise, reading notes, scribbled into a leather-bound notebook no one was allowed to see. Was he still in control, or had he accepted the fall? No one knew. What they did know was this: the model Šarić built had outlived him. Not the man, but the machine. Encrypted networks, disposable identities, transnational logistics masked by legitimate trade. The playbook was now public, and others were reading it. Interpol issued fresh alerts as cocaine seizures in the Balkans surged again, this time with new players. A Romanian shipping mogul, a Greek financier, a cartel proxy operating out of Antwerp. Each bust bore the fingerprints of Šarić's original roots. His ghost haunted the maps even as the names changed. It became clear destroying the empire wasn't just about removing its founder. It was about unlearning what he taught the underworld, a new, cleaner model of crime. One that didn't rely on street violence or cartel flags. One that looked like international business. For law enforcement, the dilemma deepened. They had captured the man, but they had not closed the system. What followed were policy shifts. Tighter scrutiny on Eastern European ports, cross-border financial task forces, shared biometric databases, But every reaction came after the fact. The empire had already adapted. And in Belgrade, as autumn light spilled across the prison courtyard, Darko Šarić walked slow laps alone, unbothered. His legacy wasn't built on presence. It was built on design, and the design still functioned. There are drug lords who rule with fear, and there are those who build with vision. Darko Šarić was the latter. His empire didn't scream, it whispered. It didn't explode, it expanded. By the time most law enforcement agencies realized what he had created, it wasn't a cartel, it was a system. And systems don't die easily. The Balkan route had once been synonymous with heroin. In the 1990s, it was a dusty trail carved by warlords and smugglers moving brown powder from Afghanistan through Turkey and into Europe. But Šarić reimagined it, repurposed it into a sleek, invisible pipeline for South American cocaine. No fanfare, no flags, just movement. Quiet, constant, profitable. He didn't bring chaos, he brought order. And that was what made him dangerous. In the years after his sentencing, authorities across Europe and Latin America have continued to wrestle with the aftermath. The methods he perfected, multi-jurisdictional laundering, false trade, manifests hybrid logistics, are now standard in high-level narcotics trafficking. What began as a single empire became a template. The lesson is as chilling as it is simple. The future of crime is scalable. Šarić proved that violence wasn't the only way to move weight across continents. With the right people, the right papers, and enough silence, you could move more product with fewer bullets and attract less attention doing it. He also proved that identity was optional. He was Daniel. He was Sandro. He was no one and everyone. A man with a dozen passports and no fixed face. His absence became his shield, his silence his weapon. But perhaps the most sobering lesson of all is this: he almost got away with it. For 5 years, Šarić evaded the full force of multiple governments, not because he was hiding in the jungle, but because he was protected by structure, by corruption, by knowledge gaps, by the slow machinery of international law. He understood the lag between intelligence and action, and he lived in that gap. His capture required cooperation across 6 countries, hundreds of agents, and a level of political will rarely seen in global investigations. And still, he walked in on his own terms. He didn't fall. He stepped down. Some believe he struck a deal unspoken, but understood. Others say he simply saw the end game and chose a softer landing. Regardless, what remains is the legacy, a quiet warning to both sides of the law. To governments that crime is evolving faster than policy. To traffickers that even the cleanest empire leaves behind footprints. Today, the Balkan route still runs. Šarić may be behind bars, but the ports remain open. The ships still sail. The docks still load and unload. The system waits for the next designer, the next architect, the next ghost with a plan. And as long as there's demand, there will be supply. Not with gunfire, but with spreadsheets. Not with tattoos, but with signatures. Because in this new era of organized crime, the most dangerous man in the room is the one who looks like he belongs. Thank you for following this crime-solving journey. If you find it interesting, don't forget to subscribe to the Crime Trail channel so you don't miss out on upcoming exciting stories.